to welcome you to this dialogue organized by the Jean Monnet Foundation for Europe. I am Gilles Grain, I'm the director of the foundation. Today, we meet to speak about a very important and relevant topic. The theme of the dialogue is Transatlantic Relations, Trends and Prospects. We are live on YouTube and Facebook, and you can ask questions anytime and interact with us on the YouTube and Facebook channels. There are the chats. I would like to thank very much my colleagues at the Foundation for making this event available, and they have become masters of technology. In particular, I would like to mention my colleagues, Nathalie Troisfontaine and Eva Paul. Let me just say very briefly a few words about the Jean Monnet Foundation. It was created in 1978 by Jean Monnet himself. Our institution has been a living memory and a place for reflection, discussion, and debate about the major issues related to European integration. Our activities are made possible by the support of the State of Vaud, the Swiss Confederation, the City of Lausanne, and the University of Lausanne. Our foundation has a unique archive, a documentation center, and a specialized library. These resources are open to all students and researchers who wish to deepen their knowledge on Europe. And we also very much like to welcome guests for visits. So really, we are an open place and we are awaiting your visit. Let me just say briefly a word about the new publication of the foundation that has just been released. It is a historical essay entitled Construction européenne, la révolution d'un continent, and it was just published a few days ago, and it's available on open access on the website of our foundation. And indeed, we regularly organize debates as well as publish booklets and books. Now, I'm extremely happy, extremely privileged to present you our two guests. Firstly, Jussi Animaki. He's a professor of international history and politics at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. He was previously a lecturer at the London School of Economics and Political Science. From 2002 to 2003, he was a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. He's the recipient of the 2002 Bernard Prize from the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations. He was elected Finland Distinguished Professor in 2006. His main research interests include American foreign policy, transatlantic relations, and the international history of the Cold War. Jussi will publish very shortly a new book. I show you the cover. It's entitled Pax Transatlantica, America and Europe in the Post-Cold War Era. It will be published by Oxford University Press and will be released this summer. And I was very privileged to read already first a copy of the book, and it's really great. A few years ago, I read a book by Jussi and other colleagues about the history of transatlantic relations during the Cold War. And now we have this complement about this most interesting period. And it's really a privilege to have this book available, and I can only advise it to everybody. Then Sylvie Matelli, she's Deputy Director of the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs. After a master's degree in international economics, she wrote a thesis on the economic determinants of military expenditure. She obtained her PhD from the Pierre Mendès France University in Grenoble. She joined IRIS in 2001 as a researcher specializing in defense economics, and then as a director of research. Now she's the deputy director of the institute. She conducts studies and research on defense industries and policies, export controls and corruption for French and European institutions, as well as for companies. She is also a member of the editorial board of La Revue Internationale et stratégique. And Sylvie has also just published a new book. I think it became available in April. It's called Géopolitique de l'économie, 40 fiches illustrées pour comprendre le monde, published by the Édition Erol. And really, it's also a wonderful book to get an initiation about many topics having to do between economics and geopolitics. And as Sylvie argues, indeed, sometimes there is a tendency to see these two fields separately, but they are very much interconnected. And this is one of the great things of this book, to interconnect them, and so to make us wiser and more knowledgeable. So it's a treat, it's a great privilege to have you on board today. And indeed, it's also a special moment because transatlantic relations have had a long history, but they also stay most relevant to understand today's world and its prospects. And indeed, we just have to think about President Biden's recent travel to Europe to remember their importance. So now, you see, let me pass you the floor.
Great. Thank you very much, Gilles, for this very, very kind introduction. And I was waiting you to tell me how I did in high school in Finland, but happily not, because that wasn't so glamorous at the time. But I really appreciate it. It's great to be with at this event, the foundation, which is an absolutely wonderful place. It's very sad we are not there, all of us together today, but hopefully that will become possible in the near future, and we can be face to face rather than screen to screen in the near future. And just also, I wanted to thank also Natalie and Eva for the organizations and Sylvie for sharing the stage. It's very nice to meet you. We haven't met before, so this is, I hope, a start of a wonderful working relationship in the future. Now, what and Gilles, thank you for kind words about my book. What I was going to just say in the next 10 minutes or so, a few words that sort of come out of that book, and that hopefully perhaps then give some food for thought as to where we are now, but where we are going, possibly going in the future regarding in particular transatlantic relations, which obviously, as you pointed out, something that have been certainly since World War II, one of the mainstays of international relations. The relations between America and Europe have in many ways dominated the international scene over the past three-quarters of a century. So, but let me maybe just one point. The reason why I wrote a book like this, which hopefully everybody will rush to buy, is basic frustration, sort of intellectual, if not otherwise, frustration about how transatlantic relations are generally viewed, and how they have sort of the news about transatlantic relations permeate our consciousness and on a sort of repeated basis, and have done so for a very, very long time. And they come to us often in a form of a conflict or a crisis. That there is this, and you can sort of, if you go to and search the bibliography about transatlantic relations, the crisis or the word conflict is often associated with this particular relationship. And certainly this has been the case for the last 30 years that I've been sort of interested in the topic, and in some ways lived a bit of a transatlantic life myself. It's that there's always something that is wrong about the transatlantic relationship. That is either something in terms of NATO, and of course very recently we've heard about how NATO is either obsolete or brain dead, depending which president you ask, whether the previous American president or the current French president. We've heard about, all these crises about burden sharing, about, the Americans always complaining how Europeans are free riders and so forth. This has been a constant theme in transatlantic relations when it comes down to the question of NATO. And so that is something that often, on top of that, of course, questions about so-called out-of-area issues that's created perhaps the biggest crisis often in transatlantic relations. If you just think back to the Iraq War back in 2003, when I happened to actually be in Washington at the time when it all started, and many Americans had very little nice to say about the French or the Germans in the context of that conflict, and so there's always this sort of the bad news tends to override our perception about the transatlantic relationship, and not just, I would argue, in the last 4 years when it was obvious that with Trump tweeting all sorts of quasi-factual nonsense on a sort of almost daily basis. It seemed that we are in a deep crisis. That the ocean that divides Europe from America was not just an ocean, but that we, as one observer put it in 2003, Americans and Europeans, they're living on different planets. More or less. I mean, that's the sort of crisis, and so that frustration, because at the same time, it seemed to me that the reality is very, very different. At least to the reality that I had observed and continue to observe today is very, very different when it comes down to transatlantic relations, and that's really what I wanted to talk about a bit today. That there is the crisis, and then, of course, the other side of the transatlantic relations, which is the idea of a community, of a transatlantic community. And in some ways, what we've seen is over the last 30 years, and why could I argue all the way going back to World War II, is the sort of roller coaster ride in which we get to a crisis and suddenly it's miraculously observed. You could argue that this cycle has just lived itself through, with the following the election of President Biden, and now his trip, as Gilles pointed out, to Europe, to G7, to NATO, to the European Union, and finally to Geneva to meet with Vladimir Putin. That there has been this sort of roller coaster ride of, certainly in terms of the narrative about the transatlantic relationship. Now, in terms of the book, I didn't want to write a roller coaster book. What I wanted to write is look at some 3 key themes, and I was going to talk about 3 very quickly today, that to me seem to prove the opposite, in terms of that this is not, while there is a conflict, ongoing conflicts emerge in this relationship, the basic structure of the transatlantic relationship actually is in a very, very firm footing. And I would even go further and argue that, in fact, America and Europe have become closer over the last 30 years rather than drifting apart. And so, talking about security, economics, and politics, very, very briefly on those 3 points. And when it comes to security, of course, NATO is the institution that dominates the discussion. I mentioned the idea that it's been obsolete, it's been brain dead, and so forth. There's these debates about the magic 2% defense spending target that everybody in NATO should meet. And that this is somehow, unless this particular target is met, then NATO is indeed obsolete, and there's no talk of burden sharing and so forth. Now, that's on the one side. We have these rhetorical arguments about NATO. On the other side, there's the very plain fact that NATO, over the last 30 years, has almost doubled in terms of its membership. It has become from a sort of purely defensive organization to an organization that actually takes active part in operations, in military operations in selected areas of the world. And it has even gone global in some ways, as we've seen in the most recent NATO meetings, where indeed the focus of much discussion was not Russia, was not Europe, it was China. So it has clearly become an institution in which not only over the past 30 years has grown in size, but has grown in terms of its overall mission. And to me, that is not that is clearly a success, if you take it in a narrow sense. That NATO clearly as an institution, and there's no accident that it's often called the most successful military alliance in history. It is going to turn 75 years old in a couple of years, and it's likely that, given its longevity and enlargement process, it is of course more than a military alliance. It is also something that's politically that provides the basic institutional connection between North America and Europe in the 21st century. And it could not be undone. In fact, I mean, one of the things that we may often forget, that even in the Trump years, when supposedly the United States was ready to scrap NATO completely, miraculously NATO added a new member only last year in the form of North Macedonia, which of course is not a huge powerhouse or a large country, but it is a symbolic, I think it's a symbolic significance of this taking place, even in the context of what was clearly a very acrimonious rhetorical relationship between America and Europe, is extremely significant. So my second point, economics, and here I think Natalie will know much more about this than I do. But my basic point that I like to iterate in the book is that, of course, there have been and there will continue to be various trade disagreements on matters of trade, on matters of protectionism, subsidies, and so forth, between the United States and Europe. With Brexit, those disagreements may even become sort of magnified, because there will be sort of the EU. It's not only about the EU and the United States, but you have obviously a sort of new manifestation of the British role in that particular context. It's been pointed out that discussions about the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership have been put on hold. They put on hold already, in fact, before Trump became president. And that shows that the transatlantic economic relations was going down the tubes, so to speak. But of course, there's the other side of the story, which is very simply put, two things. America and Europe have become much more integrated economically over the last 30 years than perhaps at any given time in the past. Now, what do I mean with that? Is basically that not only the trade that we talk about often, the headlines about trade tend to be either about disputes. Boeing, Airbus just solved actually fairly recently. It is about how the declining proportion of trade in goods, that China suddenly has become the great dominant trading power in the world over the past years. And that's true. China is, in fact, in terms of imports coming to the United States, coming to the European Union, China is the main source of those imports when it comes down to goods. There's no question about that. And that is a historic shift in many ways that's taken place over the last couple of decades. But at the same time, we have to bear in mind that while that is true, it's also true that China, when it comes down to trade in services, is a minuscule player on both American and European markets today. And when it comes down to investment, foreign direct investment, United States and Europe, the bilateral investment between the European Union and the United States far outweighs any such other investment patterns in the world, which may be changing over time, but it clearly dominates the situation. And perhaps the last point is that if you think about wealth distribution on a global scale, there's still probably no question that when we think about the transatlantic economic space, the United States or North America, more broadly speaking, and the European Union plus Great Britain, most of the world's wealth resides in that particular region today, despite the unquestionably significant rise of the Chinese economy. So that would be my second point. Now, last, there is the politics of all this. And the politics is difficult, I think. And one can point out to a number of issues. Most recently, we've talked a lot about the populists. The populists are on the rise. Trump, Brexit, all of this can be blamed on the populists. There's the Hungarian version of it with Orbán and so on and so forth. There are various populist parties that have been on the rise over the past decade, whether it's in Finland with True Finns, whether it's in Italy with the Liga, or even the Three Star movement to some extent. Of course, we have the Nationalist Front National, or now I guess just the Front in France, and all of this is undoubtedly true. There's no question this is a trend that has taken place over the past 10, 15 years. And 2016 often is pointed out as the main year in which much of this crystallized, and as a consequence, everybody got worried that indeed this will split the so-called West apart, that the transatlantic democracies will indeed start squabbling with each other because they will all be dominated by nationalist parties. Now, I worry, yes, like most people, about a phenomenon that has sort of authoritarian tendencies, as many of these populist parties clearly do. At the same time, as a historian, what's interesting to me is the parallel evolution on both sides of the Atlantic of the politics, and which is why in the book I call it the transatlantic political space. It seems to me that the rise of populism is a transatlantic phenomenon. It seems to me that even we can find other similar transatlantic phenomena, particularly in the post-Cold War era. If you think about the so-called, not as prominent perhaps, but you think about the so-called third wave of the late 1990s, with the Tony Blairs and the Bill Clintons and the Gerhard Schröders and so forth, we can see that the political trends on the two sides of the Atlantic, if they're not obviously mirror images of each other, but the trend has been to an increasing number of similarities in broadly speaking, in my mind. Now, what does that tell us? That can mean that if nationalism indeed is on the rise, that could spell doom for NATO, for cooperation in the transatlantic region. Yet that hasn't happened. What it tells me, another thing it tells me, is that there clearly is some deep connection in this political space, what I call the transatlantic political space. That there are shared concerns and shared experiences that drive politics on both sides of the Atlantic to similar directions. That the third wave was one manifestation of that. Populism, the rise of populism, is another, much more vocal, much more significant, perhaps, the manifestation of that. And the fight against populism, which we see, I think, play out today, and starting at least last year or even before, is also a transatlantic phenomenon. that we see take place internally as well as in a broader transatlantic context. So while politics often dominates the news, and politics, particularly democratic politics, are very driven by conflict. That's what they're supposed to do. Politicians are supposed to disagree and argue and so forth. It gives the appearance of a great deal of disagreement and so forth. I would, however, from a sort of bird's eye perspective, also argue that in some ways one should take some comfort in the fact that we see these similar trends evolve on both sides of the Atlantic, roughly at the same moments in time. So, long story short, so those are my 3 points in terms of security, economics, and politics, and all of that together. What I argue, and what the big point of the book is, that the transatlantic space is a closely connected community because of its institutional connections, most specifically, of course, NATO, but going beyond that in any number of other ways. It's a closely connected community because of the very deeply embedded economic links that we can see, particularly in investment patterns going both ways on the Atlantic. And it's a deeply connected space because we see that people who vote on both sides of the Atlantic have similar concerns when they vote, and hence tend to follow similar trends. Not, and don't take me wrong, I'm not saying that Trump is same as Marie Le Pen or Boris Johnson or anything like that, but the similar trends, to me, it seems have been, you can observe the evolution of similar trends. So, as a consequence, I think what I would argue, looking into the future, is that, to me, and of course, I'm not good at divination. I'm only a historian, and I can tell you that where we are today was inevitable, because I know that this is where we came, and I can look for the roots of all of this. But building upon that, it seems to me that given the long history of an evolving community, transatlantic community, I don't see any immediate reason. And we can talk perhaps about the external part of this, like China and Russia and so forth, in the discussion. I don't see any immediate reason why one should be too concerned about the decline of the transatlantic relationship in the near future. I better stop there. I'm sure I went way over my time, and I'm very curious to see what Natalie has to say, and then the questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jussi. Now, Sylvie, may I pass you the floor?
Yeah, thank you very much. First, thank you very much to Nathalie Troisfontaine and the Institut Jean Monnet for the invitation. As a citizen of the EU, I know how much we owe to Jean Monnet, and I'm really proud to speak tonight in a place he has created. Thanks a lot, Gilles, too, for your sympathetic introduction. And congratulations to Jussi for his interesting book. I really appreciate your approach. You have tried to describe and analyze the transatlantic relationship from various perspectives in a transversal vision, and not only from one point of view. And I found it give us an original and instructive perspective. That's right, that we met tonight for the first time, as you said, and not for real, but still virtually. But I'm sure this dialogue may be the beginning of an intellectual relationship. I don't know if you have some interest for economy and geopolitical issues, but I can tell you that I'm always strongly interested about history. When I was preparing my introduction for tonight, an idea first came quickly from my mind, and I agree that it is a sort of cliche, but if you think about it, it is not only a cliche, and it can be a good introduction in the dialogue. As I didn't have a long book to find idea. That first idea was that the transatlantic relationship has clearly been essential and central between US and the EU, but also in foreign relations for decades. But it has also been, and that's a strong issue, I think, it has also been fundamentally imbalanced for years, based on a strong dependence of Europeans on the US. Clearly, it is a cliche and everybody knows that. But if you try to think about that, that strong dependence between Europe and the US is not only the dependence on security and within NATO, but it has a lot of perspective. The first one is probably the dependence, the economic dependence. And since the beginning of that relationship after the Second World War, due to the US investments in Europe at the end of the Second World War, the Marshall Plan, to support the European recovery and keep the Western European countries in the West, because it was the beginning of the, I'm sorry about the light, I don't know if I can do something. There is too much sun in Paris. But I can tell you this is just at that moment, because we spent 10 years with a lot of rain, etc., etc. I don't know what to do to change the. Is it better like that? Yeah, sure. Then we were at the beginning of the Cold War, and I think it was really important for the US to ensure that European Western countries will stay in the West. And with the US. The other aspect of that economic dependence at that moment was the US dollar. And it was the core of the international monetary systems. Just remember the boom of the euro-dollar market in the 60s. And that was one of the main reasons in the failure of the gold exchange standard. Another aspect of that economic dependence, even today, while it exists a single currency in Europe, most of the European financial flows outside the EU are done in US dollars. The other aspect of that dependence between Europe and US is clearly the military and strategic one. With NATO, and because the Europeans have a lot of difficulties to build a common defense, the General de Gaulle was very critical about that dependence, and he believed that the good transatlantic relationship should be and have to be based on a relationship between allied but non-allied countries. And clearly, it is not always the case, and we have still a strong dependency between US and Europe. However, we can see that the initiatives around a European defense and the debate that results from it tend to gradually modify this balance. And I think that's the difficulty of that transatlantic relationship because we need the US, we are really dependent on the US, but in the same time, we have tried for years with more or less success to reduce that unbalanced relationship, to modify that balance in the economic and financial field. We can quote the single market in 1992, the creation of the euro, and a single and independent central bank, which we have seen in 2008 how much it worked, and with the Fed to avoid the collapse of this system. And that shows us how more balanced relationship between US and Europe can be useful for the world stability, the world prosperity. But in the same time, and as it is often the case with the EU, a crisis of the debt after 2010 has threatened the disintegration of the Eurozone. Then we are still really weak in our integration, and in the same time very resilient, and that make difficult the definition of a strategy in our relation with the US. From a strategic and military perspective, I think, and that's a personal view, that the support the Europeans have given to the US in the framework of NATO Article 5 was a sort of wake-up call. It has, for example, introduced a debate in Germany about foreign military operations. And just some years after that support, in 2003, the EU defined a security strategy, while Javier Solana was the first High Representative for the Common and Security Policy. But all this turned out to be very fragile, because the European countries were divided about the US intervention in Iraq in 2003 too. Then it shows us how we can use that transatlantic relationship to reinforce the European integration, but at the same time, it could be a weakness to improve the European integration. And that I think that may be interesting to put in perspective what happened since 2016. 2016 was the year of the election of Donald Trump, but also the Brexit, and we have seen after 2016 the stronger will than before to improve the European integration, the European affirmation in Europe, within Europe, but also in the relationship we had with the US. And we have seen four axes in this affirmation. First, an international and strategic dimension with an autonomous definition of the European relationship with China, for example. Not only as a systemic rival, but also a competitor and a potential partner. And basically, I think 2016 was really a new step in the transatlantic relationship. And basically, even if Joe Biden's speeches are, for domestic policy reasons, quite easy to understand, very harsh against China, I think his approach to the relationship with that country is quite closer to that of the European that it was with Donald Trump. And I think that Joe Biden is probably the first president, and we may talk about this later, but is probably the first president that has understood how a strong Europe may be useful for the US and for the transatlantic relationship. And that's why I'm not sure in the next few years we will see, as a lot of people thought, and as you can read in the media, I'm not sure that you will see, as it is always the case, an alignment of the European to the US, because Joe Biden is much more easy to understand and to appreciate than Donald Trump was. I think we may have sort of a sort of common view and a much more negotiated approach about our view of the world between the US and Europe. An illustration of that is probably given by the declaration of John Kerry just after having visited China. It was in May, I think, explaining that a cooperation with China could be desirable to jointly fight against climate change. Then we are not just in a definition of systemic rival when you think that you can have a partner to jointly fight against climate change. I can give you other example, but I think I speak enough yet. Another element perhaps in the reinforcement of the EU position in or the European position in the transatlantic relationship may be found in the reinforcement of the European Central Bank monetary policy in 2012 with the whatever it takes supported by Mario Draghi. But also we can find example in the Commission Industrial Policy, the Digital Market and Digital Service Act, the Recovery Plan. We have some original and new approach, new normative approach also. Then we will see, but I think we are living in a new momentum of that transatlantic relationship that I hope will be more balanced and then probably allows to have a stronger relationship and a relationship probably founded on common values we share, as you said, you see in your introduction.
Thank you so much, Sylvie, for your intervention. There are so many things to be discussed. Perhaps, if I may ask with a first question having to do with the, I would say, geostrategic and military situation. In fact, in 1964, for the first time, Jean Monnet and the members of his Action Committee for the United States Europe laid down a thinking, a vision, we may say, a strategy to have an equal and balanced partnership between United Europe and the United States. And the cornerstone was to have a European single voice on foreign and defense issues. And to do this, the idea was that the only real possibility was to apply the community method that had been working well in economic fields to these very political domains. And indeed, would you say that this vision, which has clearly not realized so far, will stay an utopia for a very long future? Or might there be prospects really to have a kind of, I would say, political and geostrategic balanced relationship?
Shall I say something? Something on it? So listen, I think and this, of course, goes to some of the points that Sylvie was just making. But to me, I mean, there is an imbalance. There's no question about that. I think that is in many ways the starting point of understanding many of the crises and conflicts and tensions in the transatlantic relationship. Is that the United States often is seen as the giant in what's the metaphor about somebody in the glass door that's breaking all the, but it's the Gulliver among Lilliputs, right? So it's the big guy on the block, and the idea of a united Europe, as you rightly point out, remains to the present, despite the European Union, despite all of this. And I think 2016, which was a reminder of how far we still are from that reality of a united Europe with Brexit and so forth. And I think even the last year dealing with the pandemic has provided plenty of ammunition of those who are skeptical of the possibility of a truly united Europe ever emerging. I mean, that's just the reality. And I think that creates an imbalance in all aspects not all aspects, but certainly in the security aspect of the transatlantic relationship and the dependency that Sylvie was alluding to of Europeans, the long-term dependency, particularly on questions of security, but also the dominant role that the United States traditionally has played in the global economy, but also, of course, in the transatlantic economic space as a consequence. So it's very difficult to see an immediate how the visions of Jean Monnet and others, how will they, if they became real, but to me it's very difficult to see how they ever can become real. And if I think of the three themes that I was discussing earlier, that in terms of security, it's always going to be the case that Portugal has a different version of security and its security interests than the Czech Republic or Poland or Finland, for that matter, if you want to go outside of NATO, and that's, or Iceland or any other or Canada or any other NATO member. That's always going to create political disagreements if nothing else. It's always, and in terms of, I think in terms of the EU and European integration, I think what has become much more balanced in the present world, in the 21st century, than ever before in the post 1945 history of transatlantic relations is the economic relationship in that, and their European Union, the creation of the European Union, the common currency, all of these things have made a significant impact on how that balance has sort of gravitated, how there's been a continuous, call it relative decline of the United States, not only in the global economy, but also in terms of the economic balance between the United States and Europe. And you sort of saw some of that emerging, I think, already in the 1990s, when you see NAFTA on the one hand being created in North America, and then of course the European Union on the other side of the conflict. That there is the sort of the imbalance, and why much of the issues about Boeing and Airbus and any other number of trade disputes that you have, on the one hand, they're very, very acrimonious and get a lot of headlines in this regard, but they're also a reflection of the fact that there is in the 21st century, the lack of an imbalance means that there is more competition from companies that maybe in some cases be headquartered in the United States or somewhere in Europe, and they often compete in a globalized marketplace. And that can create tensions between then the governments that regulate regulate those particular companies. So anyway, I don't want to perhaps, Scott, I don't know if that really answered your question actually, but perhaps address some of the points. Perhaps, I don't know if Sylvie wants to add to that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Sylvie, would you like to add comments?
Yeah, I can try to answer, to give you some ideas about that. I think that there is two really different situations in the US and in the EU concerning that issue. The leadership obsession in the US explains and defines most of the US foreign policy and their relationship with European countries for decades. They need to collaborate to create a strong West, as I said previously, what was important in front of the USSR. But after the end of the Cold War, we have seen years of weakened interest because the leadership was relocated in Asia and with China as a potential rival. Today, it seems we come back from the US perspective, we come back to a need of cohesion and share values in front of the Chinese rise. And I hope the US are ready to accept a more balanced relationship. And when I said that, it means to support European initiative. Joe Biden gave us some insurance concerning that, but it is not the case that this last year, remember the threats written by the US ambassador in Brussels against the EU initiative about defense, and it was in that case it was the European Defense Fund. That was not only the question of Donald Trump, it was the administration and the Department of State that was against European initiative in the field of defense. The situation appears much more complex in Europe. For some political leaders and for some citizens, EU integration is just a bureaucratic attempt to steal more and more instruments of sovereignty. Rules, money, defense and security, etc., etc. And then they have seen the transatlantic relationship and the relationship to the US as a relation that may weaken the EU integration and then retain their freedom of will, even if that relation is strongly unbalanced. And in the other side, you have pro-European people. That's a vision mostly defended by France and French political leaders that are convinced that a strong EU and a stronger cohesion between Europeans is a condition for a more balanced transatlantic relationship. But in reality, I think, and as you said, Jussi, it takes time, years and decades to improve European leadership and European affirmation. And moreover, it costs a lot. And that cost, plus the divisions between Europeans and in Europe, differences in our national interests are clearly break to that.
Thank you very much. If I may ask you another question in two parts. It's about NATO. First point, we know there are 30 member states, 2 in North America and 28 in Europe. How does the internal dynamics of it really work? I mean, Is it a kind of intergovernmental working which takes care of the preoccupations and the sovereignty of each country? Or are the USA the elephant in the room, and in fact they dominate everything? And the second part of the question, it directly comes from the public. It's to know if and to what extent are transatlantic relations, and so NATO also, still against Russia. I mean, every really de facto moved on from the Cold War era, or is Russia still very much important? And I may say, in the future, could China become really the new Russia for NATO?
Should I go first again? So and this is a really good question. Let me maybe preface, because this is somewhat related to preface just some of the points that were made earlier about the imbalance and so forth. It's important to remember there's also a mutual dependency that's very, very strong. And I think that actually is the glue that keeps the transatlantic relationship together. The United States increasingly, given the sort of how the globalized world has in some ways reduced America's power and influence around the world in relative terms. It also means that the United States is the world's superpower as long as it can rely upon an alliance with Europe. And if that alliance ever were to disappear, and Donald Trump might have disagreed with this, but I think that's just a plain fact, and it is something that the Biden administration clearly has recognized, and that's what explains in many ways the trips going to come before Geneva with the G7 and the EU and NATO and all those, underline the continued dependency by Americans on Europe, as well as, of course, the other way around, which is the one that we usually talk about. Now, is the US the elephant in NATO? Yes, undoubtedly that is the case, and I think in terms of dependencies, that is probably the strongest dependency that we have seen historically. Of course, there's the economy, and Sylvie talked about Marshall Plan and all of that. But Europe, relatively speaking, recovered economically quite well, relatively fast after World War II. There's some debate as to was the Marshall Plan even necessary for that particular recovery, and among historians and so forth. But in terms of security, I think that is the one of the key links, the concerns of and you mentioned Russia, that and the Soviet Union, of course, before that. This is one of the things that, of course, underlined the whole rationale behind NATO, and to some extent also one could argue its longevity beyond the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, and if you just compare the defense budgets, you compare the excitement, the concern about all the sort of key leaders among European NATO countries when Donald Trump was sort of acting the way he acted after 2016 and coming to sort of seemingly undermine the whole NATO as an institution, and compare it to the sort of the relief, the collective sigh of relief when he lost last November, without yet accepting that he lost, but still, I think it's fairly clear for everybody that Donald Trump has lost the election. And so the collective relief that you can see in Europe, and in some ways in many other parts of the world as well, that now there is, there's an adult in the room that you can talk to put it in those terms. And that has coming back to what is America's more traditional role as the country that without which, in terms of security, it still seems to be the dominant perception that not much can be done. Now, is Russia the main target of, or the main concern of NATO as a collective institution? I think that's something to debate, but I think it is certainly not the only thing that keeps NATO together. I think it is Russia that explains the existence of Russia, that explains, and no, rather the previous existence of the Soviet Union, that explains much of the enlargement process within NATO that has taken place. It's important to remember it's not that this is an imperial acquisition on the part of Washington to go and grab all those countries and add them to its hold. But the countries in East Central Europe were extremely eager, most of them, to join NATO. And why would they be so interested in joining NATO? Is perhaps there's some monetary incentive and so forth, but there is an underlying historical concern about where insecurity comes from, and it doesn't normally come from the West; it comes from the East, and therefore, that explains. And of course, there's a sort of debate of narratives going on at the moment, in which the Russian narrative is that Russia is being encircled, and its interests are being constantly encroached upon, and therefore it's justified to send troops to fight wars in Georgia, or support the movements in the eastern part of Ukraine, or even annex the Crimean Peninsula and so forth. All of this is justified, whereas in reality, of course, it probably is not, right? And I think most of us would probably agree upon that. But that's the sort of narrative that's being spinned, and so. So yes, Russia is still, it's without Russia, it's very hard to explain NATO enlargement and all of that process. It is, however, I think what NATO has and the evolution over the past couple of decades shows that it's gone much beyond the sort of concern of the near neighborhood, which would be Russia in this case. In search, we talk about the 360-degree strategy of NATO, and of course NATO went out of area immediately after the Cold War ended, to the first to the Balkans, but then later on to Afghanistan and so forth. So and in this last communique that just came out after Biden's visit, of course, the role of China is there. It's hard to see how China presents the sort of imminent, immediate geopolitical threat, in a sense that there would be Chinese troops coming to Europe. And that is not the concern, but I think it's a reflection of how we regard security differently today. That it's not so much about boots, armed soldiers walking in boots to Poland or somewhere, but rather it's the other things. It's cybersecurity. It's these things that in a globalized world certainly cross borders in ways that was not a concern some 30 years ago, and so I think that's where the sort of the role of China is important. And maybe just the last point, just Sylvie referred to this earlier, that this is not a new concern either for the United States. I think it's a bit less, China is a bit less of a concern, it seems to me, in Europe at the moment. But in the United States, it's the concern, the sort of existential threat is from China today. And because of because the United States also, I think the Biden administration and even the Trump administration before it felt that in order to confront China, they need Europe on their side. Going back to my earlier point about how there's a mutual dependency, the United States cannot go at it alone. That would be sort of shooting yourself in the foot. That's why we saw last year when Mike Pompeo was still the Secretary of State, he was doing tours around Eastern Europe and elsewhere, waxing lyrical about the Chinese threat. And that's why, of course, today also we see the same sort of message coming from the Biden administration. I'll stop there.
Yeah. If I may add some elements, I think, as you said, Gilles, I think the US has been the elephant in the room for years, clearly. But China divides us, as you just said, you see, and I think Joe Biden has understood that. But he has also understood that mobilizing people and democracies around our values, human rights, freedom, etc., may be much more efficient to limit the rise of China than a trade war. I used to talk when I described the US policy against China, the Biden policy against China. I used to talk to use the word soft war. As it seems to be a sort of war between using much more soft power than a hard one. And a soft war is not really a war, nor a cold war, but a competition of values, political regime, economic systems to capture global influence and leadership, and consequently to be able to dominate playing rules. In the first step of such a strategy, you need to convince. I would say you need to seduce. And as China is already a step ahead in emerging countries, in Asia and Africa, I think Joe Biden tries to preserve his advantage with his allies in Europe. And in that perspective, he needs to accept, and he has a strong interest to accept a new balance, even within NATO. I don't know what may be the consequences of that software for NATO, but I was really interested in the last summit, the last NATO summit final declaration, and you may have seen that China, which is clearly the US priority, was only quoted in the two last paragraphs, while Russia was quoted, I think it was 27 times. Then I interpret that as a US renouncement to put China as a strong focus in NATO and in NATO in the future of NATO, keeping the focus on Russia. And I think that's a first. Perhaps I'm wrong, but I would like to think that it is a first example of the consequences a new balance of power within NATO may have, and maybe in the future. I don't know, we will see, but I think that could be the new way to negotiate and to think NATO in the next years.
Thank you very much. If I may now mention the economic field again, we remember that a few years ago, a project to create a Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP, was discussed, but it could not be finalized. Would you see any reasonable perspective in the future that one day we have a real US-EU free trade agreement, and perhaps in the longer future, a kind of real transatlantic single market? Or is it a utopia?
Maybe as it is economics, I can begin. Well, I think trade agreements appear more and more difficult to negotiate and to be accepted by people. That's the case in Europe, but I'm sure, as we have seen, the situation and the situation of the democracy in the US last year, it will be the case in the US too. Then I'm not sure even with a president as Joe Biden in the US, we will try to negotiate a new trade agreement. It takes years. And finally, people in Europe and in the US do not agree with that kind of agreement. Moreover, there is a lot of difficulties to find a trade agreement that will respect and limit the climate change. There is all that debate, and I'm not sure it will be the way we will improve the transatlantic relationship. But what we can see, and that's really important, and that will probably define a new way to cooperate, perhaps a new agreement, but that won't be a trade agreement. It is the place and the role of state in the economy, and clearly the challenges we have to face in the next few years. And maybe I may say perhaps in the next months and or next days will lead to more political actions to fight against climate change, to fight against inequalities, to regulate the economy, to regulate financial markets, etc., etc. And in that perspective, if you agree that the future will lead us to a more important role for states and the need to more cooperation between states to front that challenges, we will find a way to cooperate and to redefine the transatlantic relationship. One element important in that perspective is that, and the COVID crisis was an illustration of that. We have seen during that COVID crisis, we have seen that the competition between private pharmaceutical companies combined with a huge public financing has allowed to find numerous vaccines against the virus in some weeks. But it has also shown that this is supposed to redefine not only the place and the role of states, but also the relationships between state and the private sector. In that field, I think that Europe was some advance compared to the US with the taxonomy, with a lot of initiative trying to regulate and to redefine the relationship between public and private sector. I think with Joe Biden, I think that Joe Biden administration has taken the advantage this last week. Then and taking that advantage, it may probably impose its own rules. Then that will be a way to negotiate between Europe and US, because we have seen how difficult it could be for Europe to just accept US rules. I don't know what will be the way, the future, but more than a trade agreement, I think that the negotiation will be on that kind of elements, the place and the role of state in the economy, the relationship between private sector and public and states. And that's really important, because I usually say at the beginning of the dialogue, the economic relationship between US and Europe is really strong and unique in the world economy. Then they have really a way to preserve our values, our democracies, our economic prosperity, etc., etc.
You see, you like to?
Yeah, I mean, there's not that much to add. I think that's very much I would say. But I think, I mean, the trouble with the TTIP and any such sort of big all-encompassing agreement is that they will run into all sorts of political roadblocks on both sides of the Atlantic. I mean, you can imagine in the United States, I mean, this would be starting something like that would be a gift to any protectionist tendencies within the Republican Party, but also a gift to any sort of environmentalists and so forth. So it would be an endless array of, as we've seen in past in many occasions, this would become, you know, it's at best a sort of long-term possibility, but my sort of assumption is that you will see some more incremental agreements about specific issue areas and so forth. But just, you know, much as, you know, the recent Brexit talks between UK and the European Union showed, it's a minefield of all sorts of difficulties and not really always a constructive one in that sense. So, but at the same time, again, you know, the fundamentals are very strong, and so I think that's what really matters for going forward.
Thank you. Of course, we are reaching the final time, but still, I would like to ask you a very last question, if I may, about another world, another field, but also very important. It's about scientific and cultural relations. And of course, it would be nice to try to speak briefly about it, but really, basically, what is the state of these relations? What could we imagine as prospects, or put it otherwise on a very specific footing? For example, do European students still dream about going to the USA and studying there? And for example, on the other way around, is Europe a kind of dream destination for American tourists, for example? So these kind of interpersonal connections, could you briefly comment on this? Jussi, would you like to start?
Sure. I mean, I can tell you a million anecdotes, and I can tell my own personal experience, but I think, I mean, the America does not, in my essence, in the sort of collective imagination of, and I grew up in Finland, which is an outlier in this whole business. America figured very large in the sort of, and Hollywood and all these things figured very large in the collective imagination. They were cool things and all that. It was aspirations and so forth. And it's probably this reason why I myself went to the United States to study, you know, previous millennium. But still, that was the case. I think the appeal of America in some ways hasn't disappeared. In some ways it has become less. It's become more of a sort of curiosity, and I think this is in part the sort of, not the, I think, a long-term effects of, call it globalization, call it you know, the lack of the Cold War setting of good and evil, in which to many people America was good and the Soviet Union was evil, and it was obviously easy to identify more with the good, right? But even, of course, in that context, I mean, we think about then the 1960s and the 1970s, the Vietnam War and whatnot. So there's never a sort of universal acclamations in Europe about the United States. So I think it's still, you know, there's a great deal of fascination among my students. I would think about the United States. There's a great deal of sort of, certainly in the last 4 years, that fascination turned into, and my son, who went to university a couple of years ago in Pittsburgh, had spent a year and he'd had enough. So that's totally anecdotal, and does not necessarily figure in this. But there are also, I think, the contrasts in American society and the sort of the negative aspects have, in some ways, dominated a lot of the public discussion, and Donald Trump sort of brought it all out the world to see. And you just think about January of this year and the insurrection and so forth. So none of this is very good for the public image of the United States as or the so-called American dream. So I think that that certainly has become less of it has less cachet, so to speak, today than it perhaps did some 30, 40 years ago. And indeed, today, when we talk about, we can't really easily use terms like the free world and the leader of the free world. I mean, Donald Trump, leader of the free world, that didn't go well in the same sentence. And I don't hear the term free world obviously used since, free world as opposed to what, and that has changed the sort of collective, I think, idea of America. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but at the same time, I think the other way around. I think Europe still has that certain appeal to not everybody in the United States, but certainly certain segments. It has that. That has that appeal, but I think at the same time, because of globalization, because of all the sort of academic discourse and other discourse about various forms of discrimination and how they play out and are often exacerbated in the American setting and under a spotlight in the American setting, whether it's racial tensions or something else. I mean, these are all things that sort of undermine this mythic image of America as the land of the free and the this and the that. So I think all of that is there. Now, maybe, sorry, I could go on forever, of course, but it's maybe one last point that at the same time, in terms of, because I think you mentioned, scientific and in cultural scientific things. I think what Sylvie mentioned earlier, which is, so how did we get these vaccines so fast? And I think that's where the transatlantic connection is extremely strong. And it's part it's economic, we have this multinational cooperation that can produce these vaccines and so forth. But in part, it's also the academic and scientific collaboration and networks that are extremely strong. And in part were developed already in the Cold War context, but have become, I think, increasingly close over the past 2-3 decades. And as an academic, I've lived that connection, not as a science professor, but in another kind of field, and it is those links are nothing is unbreakable, but they are extremely sort of embedded in the whole idea of sort of the exchange of ideas and so forth. And I think that's the one of the often unspoken things that keeps this, what I call the transatlantic community, has made it more and more interconnected over the past few decades. End of story.
Yeah. Excuse me, I will answer that question not as an expert of that issue, but with some personal remarks. As Yuzi told us, I think this last years, but not only the 4 years of Donald Trump presidency, also the interventions in Iraq, in Afghanistan, that perhaps too strong leadership of the US in the last year are probably reduce the attractiveness of the US for European young people and the brightness of the American dream. What I found interesting today is to see how a US broadcast platform as Netflix or Amazon Prime or what you want can today diffuse a new image and perhaps a view about Europe and the rest of the world, but also Europe, France, Germany, etc., in the US. And what is interesting in that is that I think for American people, most of American people thought that the American dream was was a real dream, was a real paradise, and you may and most of them never dreamed to come in Europe and to live in Europe. That was only some people from some categories of in the US. But today it seems that you, as European young people, used to dream to go live and succeed in the US, even if it has diminished last year. I think you may have, due to that movies and promote back that American platform, you may have a new dream in the US, the dream perhaps to move to live for some years the US, to live in Europe. And that's really interesting because that may cross culture, that may open American people. That's not the perception we have when we work on geopolitical issues, because with the American first of Donald Trump, it seems that American people are going are more and more clothing their country and focus on their own interests and their own destiny. But I think that's not the only way, and I think we will have some interesting new aspects of the American perception of us in Europe in the future. Yeah.
Yes, you see a final word.
So if I can just, I think this nicely sums up the thing about imbalance that we've been talking about a lot today. But I think there's also an imbalance in terms of how most of us, whether we're in Europe, in North America, in Australia, in many other parts of the world, we still have a fascination about the United States and the events in the United States. Perhaps it's the CNN effect or something like that. But it is something that we all are concerned about at one level or another. That last November, we were all, at least everybody I knew, was glued on for a week, trying to figure out, is Trump really going to win another term or not, and counting the votes and so forth, so on and so forth. And I don't see the same thing happening when there's a French election, however close it is. I don't see anybody in the United States, or very few in the United States, staying up all night wondering who's going to be the next French president or the next UK prime minister, and so forth. And in that sense, the United States still has this larger than life role in our sort of collective imagination, and that's another kind of transatlantic imbalance perhaps that still persists in 2021.
Wonderful. Well, Sylvie, you see, I would like to thank you wholeheartedly for your participation and everything you said. I think it was a wonderful event, and we were able to speak about the various dimensions of this very complex transatlantic relations issue. It has an history, it has a current situation, and it has a future, and many dimensions in it. And of course, it's a theme that will stay, and the debate is, of course, never over. But for now, we have to leave it here. And it has been so wonderful to have you. And I hope that our members in the public could enjoy this event. And I would like to wish you all a very, very nice summer. And we are looking forward to seeing you in the fall for new debates, new discussions. So take care. And from Lausanne, bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think the 5 seconds are gone.
5 seconds are gone.
Thank
Good.
you. Thank you again so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care. Have a nice summer break.
That's great. Thank you so much, and have a great summer. We'll hope to